Welcome everyone. I'm so excited to see you all here this evening. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this virtual launch of our exciting new publication from the Linnean Society. So the Linnean Society of London was founded in 1788 and based on the collections of the Swedish naturalist Carl Linnaeus, whose botanical, zoological and library collections have been in the keeping of the Society since 1829. And since then, the collections have continued to fulfill their purpose as a primary reference collection of fundamental importance to taxonomy and have been regularly added to. So it's not a static collection at all. It's been regularly added to by our fellows who've included luminaries like Charles Darwin, Alfred Russel Wallace, Robert Brown, Marie Stopes, and David Attenborough. And the idea for this first book of treasures from the Linnean Society springs from the Society's ambition to bring these extraordinary collections to ever wider audiences and communicate the scientific advances that made about the natural world. This book has been 2 years in the making. It's a project that was led by Special Publications Manager Leonie Berwick and Head of Collections Isabelle Charmantier. We're very grateful to them for doing such a sterling job, and we're thrilled to celebrate the publication of this book. I'd like to warmly congratulate them and all the authors who've contributed on this wonderful achievement. So welcome again to this evening's celebration. Thank you.
Thanks, Olwen. I'm going to share screen now so that we can start our presentation.
Thank you very much, Olwen. I'm Isabelle Charmantier. I'm the head of collections, and I'll let Padma start the slideshow.
Yeah. Okay. Can everyone see it now?
I can, yeah.
All fine? Okay.
So thank you. I'm Isabelle Charmantier. I am the head of collections, and welcome everyone to this launch of our very first books of treasures. This launch should have happened in our beautiful library, and maybe Padma, if you want to go to the next slide, we can see the library, which would have been a lovely event. We had planned displays of some of the items that are in the book to feature in our display cases. There would have been talks and a glass of Prosecco in the library while chatting to all the participants at the end. And as lovely as that would have been, the number of attendees would have been a little bit more than 100 people maximum. That's how our meeting room capacity. So it's a far cry from all the people who have been able to join us here this evening to attend this virtual launch. And to have so many people joining from so many parts of the world is incredible, it's wonderful, and it's also slightly terrifying. So Lainey and I are just going to do a quick introduction before leaving our speakers to present their materials, just to explain how we came to this idea of a book of treasures. And I think we came to this idea both independently through our different experiences of dealing with the collections at the Linnean Society. And certainly other books of treasures, like especially in my case, the Royal Botanical Garden, Edinburgh's botanical treasures were an inspiration. But mostly the idea came out of three factors. First of all, we have researchers and readers who come to use our library and who often make discoveries and research in-depth elements of our collections that we don't know so well. And indeed, sometimes we get things out for them that we didn't even know we had. Secondly, we've had a permanent archivist, Liz McGow, in the collections team. And since she's been hired, we've had a program of cataloging our archival collections, so mostly our manuscript, for a publicly accessed online catalog. And again, this has led to us knowing better what we have in our collections. And thirdly, we have been used to giving collections tour, And this is something that has been done by all previous librarians. You can see them here, different generations of librarians, Gina Douglas, Linda Brooks, and Elaine Charwat, who started the monthly Treasures Tour for the general public and who will be speaking this evening. And we're all shown here in the collection store, which holds the Linnean collection, so the collections of Carl Linnaeus, including his books, his manuscripts, and his specimens. And when we give a tour of the collection, it lasts about an hour and a half, and we probably spend a good chunk of the tour in the collection store, as the collections of Carl Linnaeus are probably our most treasured possessions and collections. But there are so many other treasures in archival boxes, in drawers, in cupboards that we never really have the time to show to the public or members of visitors, people who come on tours. And these are beautiful and meaningful items which tell the story of the Linnean Society and of natural history in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, at a time of colonialism, empire, and scientific discoveries, such as Alwyn mentioned earlier. So really these three factors came together for me to think we really need something that showcases our collections beyond what we show on the tour. And I'll let Leonie come in now and explain her own reasons.
Sorry, thanks, Isabel. So the next slide shows basically that I got some of my ideas from doing the internal publications for our fellows, which is Pulse and the Linnean. So similarly to what Isabel has said, we've been thinking about the idea of a book of our treasures for many years, but we had to work out how we were going to fit it around all of our other work. Over the years, there have been many articles in the Society's membership publications, the Linnean and Pulse, as I said. They've been written by fellows, researchers, and staff, and they've looked at certain items in our collections in a lot more depth. So from this, I'd started to build a little collection of stories. Additionally, our curator of artifacts, Glenn Benson, who you'll hear from a bit later this evening, he brought in a souvenir book from his home institution, the V&A, a few years ago, which very visually outlined items in their collection. And although our book looks very different from that one, that book was definitely a catalyst. It got us thinking about having our own book of treasures. So together, Isabel and I started building ideas for the book. We realized that if left to our own devices, we would go on forever. So we decided to limit it to 50 items. We did this for several reasons, one of them being our sanity, but also because we realized we wanted to call the book L. This would represent Linnaeus, as his initial is used in taxonomy. It would represent the Linnean Society, and also it's the Roman numeral for 50, so it tied everything together. We wanted to include a variety of items, and because this book is for fellows and all visitors to take away with them, we realized early on that we would include our, for want of a better term, greatest hits. So things that are usually out on display for tours, like Darwin's Vasculum, for example, or things that usually tend to get a gasp in the Linnean collections. We also wanted to include many items with fantastic stories that most people, including many of our fellows, probably won't know about. So we hope if you do buy a copy that you'll be pleasantly surprised by the variety of things, always new to you. We made sure that we wanted to include portraits, manuscripts, original illustrations, books, specimens, and artifacts, the whole range of things. It's been structured chronologically in order to give the reader an idea of science pre-Linnean society, the society's beginnings, and the part it plays in science today. So our aim was to open the cupboards and drawers and boxes of the society so that even the most seasoned scientist or historian learns a little something that they didn't know about before. So without further ado, I will introduce the very first speaker of the evening. So if you want to change the slide, Padma. So if it's Stephanie Holt. Sorry, I'm just going to check something. There we go. So Stephanie Holt is an ecologist specializing in bats and is the UK Biodiversity Training Manager at the Natural History Museum's Angela Marmont Centre for UK Biodiversity. Recently, she managed identification trainers of the future an HLF-funded project providing traineeships in identifying UK species and in science communication. We are also very lucky at the Society to be able to call Steph one of our trustees. So I'll hand it over to Steph.
Thanks, Leonie. Well, hi, everybody. I'm Steph, as Leonie has said, and I work in the Angela Marmont Centre for UK Biodiversity at the Natural History Museum. And I'm also currently one of the Linnean Society Council members and trustees. Now, I've studied bats since I was a child. I first got hooked on them on a bat walk when I was just 12, and I've been fortunate enough to build a career working with them. At the NHM, through my colleagues in mammal curation, I get access to amazing bat specimens, from the largest to the smallest, the oldest to the just plain weirdest, in many ways like this Barbastelle bat you can see on the screen here, which is one of the rarest species in Europe, which was sent to us last year at the museum, having been found sadly dead in the pocket of a coat in a shop warehouse in the middle of Salisbury in Wiltshire. But if we can flick on to the next slide, a specimen that has always intrigued me is held rather undisturbed in a corner of the collections at the Linnean Society. And it's a bit of an unobtrusive specimen, and it's housed in a little box in the collection store. But it's a bat specimen that to this day, very little is known about. Strikingly, it's also the only mammal specimen that the Society holds. Now, until recently, the data to be found with this specimen was just a scrap of paper from the 1970s with little information on it really, other than Placotus spur. And if we can click onto the next slide, Padma, as you can see, it doesn't have a full confirmed species name. So that's always intrigued me. With careful measurements, we're now confident that it is Placotus auratus, as it was suggested it might be on this original note from 1977. That's the brown long-eared bat. That's one of our more common species in the UK, and it's known throughout the majority of Europe, apart from some of the real southern Greece, that sort of area. But there's still so much we don't know about this particular specimen. Basic information like how old it is or where it was collected is entirely absent. And critically for the Linnean Society and its collections, was it Linnaeus's? If not, why is it in the collections and who could have put it there? And those problems have always just intrigued me with this particular specimen. If we can go to the next slide. Now, Linnaeus, of course, is best known for studying plants. He collected thousands of plant specimens, but he did study bats too. And Placotus auratus is just one of the species that he described and named, and it is included in Systema Naturae. Critically, he also revolutionized the taxonomy of bats. He followed Ray by grouping them with the four-footed animals in his Quadrupeda, rather than with birds where they'd always been before. And he'd also studied them for a really long time as well. If we go on to the next slide, and you can just see a close-up on one of the notebooks that was on that previous slide. This is Linnaeus's notebooks written between 1727 and 1730. And you can see an unmistakable drawing of a bat and those big ears. It has to be a brown long-eared bat. And there's a description of it too. You might just be able to see if you peer really closely at your monitors tonight that he's used his original name for the species, which is Vespertilio auratus, rather than Placotus auratus, which he renamed it as, and as we know it today. But this specimen is still shrouded in mystery. It's mystery I hope that we can tackle at some point. It's going to take quite a lot of delving, and I'm not sure we'll ever necessarily get to the complete answer here. But I'm just going to leave you, if we can click to the final slide, on this marvelous little drawing of a brown long-eared bat from Linnaeus's notebook, because as well as the specimen, I do love this little sketch too. Thank you very much for coming along tonight. I really hope you enjoy the rest of the talks this evening, and I really hope you enjoy the book. I had great fun writing my little section of it, and I'm sure other people did too.
Thank you very much, Steph. Our next speaker is Ranit Bhuyan. Ranit comes from a family of tea planters in Assam. He's a tea historian and a committee member of the London Tea History Association. Ranit first came to our library to use the Inch Tea Library collection and made himself very popular among staff by bringing us some real proper tea packets, which we were very grateful for. Ranit, over to you.
Thank you very much. Warm welcome to everybody, especially those of you who are from very difficult time zones and those who have cups of tea beside them. I'm going to talk to you about two books in the Inch Library. These two books are tea auction catalogues from the days of the East India Company, who had the monopoly of tea. The two books, one is from 1797 and the other is from 1836. Now, in my research, I've only come across two others. One is of the Swedish East India Company, which is having everything from tea to porcelain to spices. And the other is a lone tea broker's catalog, and both of these are in university archives. Now, for a tea historian like me, discovering an East India Tea Company tea auction catalog is like a Bible scholar discovering the Gutenberg Bible. So I was very excited, and I'm very happy to present the story behind these two books, which are around 200 years old. In a library, a catalog is normally in the lowest pecking order after the reference books, the classics, but not these two. So we'll take you to the next slide now. In the middle, you have an image from one of the catalogs from 1797. This is the sale in March. Auctions were held every quarter in those days. Now on the left, you have some script in green, and on the right, you have something in black. Now, this is not the political left or right, but on the left, you have the commercial activity, which went alongside the tea auction catalogs. In 1669, the East India Company imported 149 pounds weight of tea, which then went up to 800,000 pounds in 1705, and then it reached a staggering 4.72 million pounds by 1750, and then it went up and up and up, and by that time, tea was such a craze that there were tea grocers. Even undertakers were selling tea. And in 1783, there were 33,000 registered tea grocers. The East India Company lost its monopoly, and they conducted their last tea auctions in 1885. But the tea auctions continued as the industry tea auctions. On your right side, you have the political activity, which took place to get the teas into the tea catalogs. So there was colonization, railways were built, bridges were built, and of course, there were the wars. It's a very long list, but the important ones were the two Opium Wars in 1838 and 1856, which literally brought down Imperial China. And of course, there was the Boston Tea Party, which is being debated even today. And you can imagine all this commercial and political activity just to get the teas into this tea auction catalog. We'll go to the next slide now. Here is a typical page from the tea auction catalogs, and you could see various notations and codes. These notations talked about the quality, the state of the tea, the packing, and the concept of notations and the structure of these tea catalogs, in fact, continued for the next 319 years, up to the last tea auctions in 1998, from East India Company House to the commercial sale rooms to Plantation House, and then two other venues. The tea auctions in those days were called the candlelight auctions because the candles had notches And when the flame reached that particular notch, the bidding for that lot was stopped, and it went on to the next notch. So they were called the candlelight auctions. And in the early days, the tea auctions took place every quarter, as I told you, and they continued for 6 days, all in the city of London. And they were so loud that you could hear them literally 5 streets away. In the 1836 tea auction catalogue, I found a notation saying that there would be a proposed sale of £6 million weight of tea. And at that time, they had already fixed the value at around £1.6 million of money. And I happened to just look at the value in today's value. It's about £256 million from just one tea catalogue. So I'm happy that after 200 years, this lowly tea catalogue has now got its place of prominence. Thank you very much for listening. And if any of you want a longer version and more details, I could send you a PDF. Please contact the Linnean Society. And enjoy the world's greatest beverage, tea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ranit. That was really good. Thank you. So if we can move on to the next slide, then the next speaker is Dr. Mark Spencer. Dr. Mark Spencer is a botanist who lectures regularly and globally, and who has co-authored many academic papers. Recently published his first non-academic publication, Murder Most Florid, which details his work as a forensic botanist. I've actually got it here. It's very good. It's highly recommended if you can get your hands on it. But he is also the Society's honorary curator of botany. We're very proud to have him as our curator of botany. So over to you, Mark.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Leonie, for introducing me. Before I actually talk about this particular image and specimen in front of me, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about herbariums, because some of you may have not actually visited a herbarium or know what they are. And the way I often describe a herbarium is essentially, it's like a plant library in itself. So it's a library within a library, in the case of the Linnean Society. A herbarium specimen is a squash dried plant. It has been flattened and preserved. And the aim of this is to preserve the characters that aid identification and help us understand the plant, give it a name, and help us understand biodiversity. And all of these aspects of collecting specimens is incredibly important, because without actually collecting objects and actually having a framework for understanding their provenance, their attributes, and potentially also their uses, our ability to understand the planet is diminished. And the way we hold that together is through the scientific name, or one of the ways we can do that is through the scientific name. So we are incredibly lucky that amongst the hundreds of millions of botanical specimens housed around the world, so for example at the Natural History Museum, there are 4 or 5 million specimens of plants in their herbariums. Kew Gardens has 1 million or 2 more. And the Society's collection is incredibly important, but it's tiny in comparison. So we have about 14,000 of Carl Linnaeus specimens. And we're incredibly lucky to be the owners and custodians, more importantly, of these collections, because Carl Linnaeus' collections really are the bedrock of understanding botany and biodiversity and plants around the world today. So the binomial system that he innovated and formalized and pushed into the modern world in many ways is the cornerstone of much of world commerce, such as tea, as has just been discussed. Without the name Camellia sinensis, coined by Carl Linnaeus, world commerce would be much, much harder to proceed with. So Carl Linnaeus' 14,000 specimens are justly recognized as being immensely important, but sitting somewhat quietly beside this enormously important collection is a fantastic collection, and that is the collection of the Society's founder, James Edward Smith. And it's actually almost twice the size. It's 27,000 specimens in total. And Smith's collection is a bit of a Cinderella collection in many ways academically, yet it holds many, many treasures, including specimens from Captain Cook's second voyage, specimens that belonged to Carl Linnaeus' son, also known as Carl, and a great deal of many other important 18th and early 19th century botanical collectors. And it's fair to say that this Cinderella status exists within our own territory of interest of taxonomists, the people who name, describe plants and organisms, but also in the wider academic world, understanding how biological materials, biological collections can help us get an understanding and appreciation of our history and our culture and our identities. And which leads me to this specimen here of the Gulgong tree was collected in 1793. And it was collected from what we now know as Sydney, but was also included essentially with what we would describe as the Eora territory, the indigenous nations of this part of the world of Australia. And it was collected by a man called Dr. John White. Now, White was part of what is often referred to as the First Fleet, the convict fleets that, that Britain sent over to Australia to form what became modern-day New South Wales. The fleet departed in 1787 and arrived in New South Wales, as we came described, 2 years later. Now, White's primary role was as a surgeon. But amongst all his experiences of traveling and then landing in this new land to him was this staggering diversity of plants and animals and different peoples that he was unfamiliar with. So he and other scientifically trained people started to establish ways of documenting these plants and collecting them. And what White did was to send these specimens to James Edward Smith back in England. Next slide, please. Now, Smith, by this time, was a sort of heading into early middle age, and he had established a reputation in Britain and internationally as a custodian of scientific materials. He had acquired Carl Linnaeus' specimens and collections and libraries and manuscripts under the advice of Sir Joseph Banks. And he was collecting and formulating his own personal collections. And he was very, very keen, very lucky to receive the collections of White. Now, this acquisition of Smith, as exemplified many other people in England at this time, helped him develop an understanding of this completely new landscape and biodiversity around him, but also was so much in the context of colonial imperial Britain, also part of that endeavour of looking at biodiversity in other parts of the world and seeing what we could do with it for the empire. And ultimately, one of the ways this was expressed for this particular plant, as it was then described, Eucalyptus robusta, was the potential for it as timber. It became known as New Holland mahogany. And through that identity, it was basically driven into other parts of the world where it was commercialized and used as a crop plant. But the part I want to really focus on here is actually looking at this specimen here, the plant here. This is this specimen collected in 1793. It became the basis of this important series of artwork known as a specimen of botany of New Holland. And these materials were actually some of the first known documentation of the natural history and biodiversity of Australia. So this is an incredibly important and very, very early record of Australia's plant life, and is part of, the identity and history of the society, but it is also a part of the world's cultural heritage and the heritage and culture of the Eora people of Australia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Fascinating. Our next speaker is Dr. David Lauther. He is a historian of scientific culture in 18th and 19th century Britain and a tutor at University College at Durham University. He is also a fellow of the Linnean Society, who is a regular user of our library and collections.
Many thanks, Isabelle, and good evening, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed the talk so far. I think it's been absolutely fascinating, and I'm going to dive straight in about Hardwicke, whilst also, and the proviso at the outset, I'm also looking at some other collections across other archives to try and give a sense of Hardwicke as a man and as a naturalist. So Hardwicke's probably a name that's well known to members and fellows of the Society, particularly anybody who is interested in the history of zoology. So he was one of the most significant naturalists and patron collectors at work in early 19th century India. And he played a key but sometimes overlooked role in the development of zoology as we recognize it today. So as a collector, his achievements were absolutely colossal. And his surviving image collections alone amount to several thousand individual drawings and paintings. Many of these were commissioned from South Asian artists, the identities for whom remain largely unknown, and the paintings themselves rank as some of the finest examples of company art. And as historians are increasingly recognizing, these images were important to the practice of natural history, given the primitive methods of preserving physical specimens at the time. They acted as permanent records of species as they may have appeared in life and played a key role in the naming and classification of species. But first though, and on to the next slide, please, a little bit about the man himself. So he was born in 1756 and he spent 45 years in India as a soldier in East India Company service. He was involved in most of Britain's various expansionary wars in India between the 1780s and the early 1800s, but by the 1820s he'd risen to the rank of a Major General and he commanded the artillery near Calcutta. So as he grew in seniority, Hardwicke devoted considerable energies and time to natural history, I think beginning around 1790. But his curiosity extended beyond the subcontinent, and we can see this in the image on the left of this slide, which is a pen and ink drawing of a toucan, and it's one of hundreds of similar images now held by the Natural History Museum. But these particular paintings pose some questions. Who made them? What use did Hardwicke have of them in Bengal? Were they created in India and copied from other paintings, or did they come into Hardwicke's possession through exchanges with other naturalists? So I haven't yet had an opportunity to dig into any of those questions, but I'm pretty sure that they would make a good research project in their own right. Now, we've been left with a glimpse of Hardwicke as a naturalist and as a man in an account written by the then Bishop of Calcutta, a man called Reginald Heber, who visited Hardwicke in 1823. Heber described a bizarre but intriguing evening where the general entertained his guests and his fellow officers by showing them not only the paintings, but by introducing them to a large menagerie of living animals. And these included, and I quote, a very pretty antelope, a vampire bat, a gibbon, a long-armed ape, a cobra, and some others. And Heber noted in particular Hardwicke's apparent bond with the vampire bat, which was lively, affectionate, and playful. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. A similar sense of Hardwicke is given by this image and by the notes. And where possible, it seems that Hardwicke instructed his artists to make drawings from life. And in this example, he gives a description of the snake, noting other drawings that may have been made. But it goes on, and very engagingly, I think, to state that the specimen itself escaped from its cage and continued about the house several months, and finally took to the garden and remained unmolested a long time. Now, if we go on to the final slide, this image is from a painting in the Linnean Society's collections, and I think one of the finest. And Linnean, I believe, has a couple of dozen of Hardwicke's paintings. And this one was produced in a very different way. This was painted in 1820, again by an unknown artist, and based on some notes and fragments of skin and bone that had been sent to Hardwicke from another naturalist in Nepal. Now, assuming that the species was a type of marten, Hardwicke wrote a brief description to accompany this painting, both of which were sent to the Linnean Society in January 1821. Now, what happened next is a little bit obscure, but in the end, the paper was not read into the Society until 1827. And by this time, Hardwicke had been pipped to the post. And a French naturalist, Frédéric Cuvier, who was the brother of Georges Cuvier, had published his own description and image of what he correctly identified as a species new to European science, which he named the panda, the original panda. So whether Hardwicke actually minded losing priority in naming the red panda, which today is one of the most charismatic and instantly recognizable of all endangered mammals, hasn't been recorded, but the painting itself has remained in the Linnean's collections. Now, Hardwicke returned to Britain in 1826 and brought his paintings with him, and happily for us, some of these formed the basis of a famous published work, which was Gray's Illustrations of Indian Zoology. But I think that the published drawings really only give a very brief glimpse of a remarkable man who led an equally remarkable career in natural history. And it's perhaps these unknown treasures, like the couple that I've highlighted, hopefully tonight, that have the most to say. So I hope that you found that interesting, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have in the Q&A afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was brilliant. It was really fascinating. So moving on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Elaine Charwat. So Elaine may be very familiar to many of you this evening because she was the Society's Deputy Librarian from 2011 to 2016. So she knows our collection well. It was Elaine who initiated the Society's Adopt Lin scheme in order to conserve items in our collections. Currently, Elaine is working towards her doctorate studying models and casts in natural history collections funded by AHRC in collaboration with UCL and the Oxford University Museum of Natural History. So take it away, Elaine.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for coming. So my first hands-on experience of these stately red volumes was lugging them around as a deputy librarian during the big building works of 2013. And I was curious, so I started leafing through them, and next time I looked up, it was hours later. So they are really a journey around the world in thousands of animals, great and small, familiar and unknown, common or indeed extinct. But not only the animals themselves were fascinating, but how they were captured, from different forms of printing to photographs to original drawings, sometimes in unusual and unexpected styles and colors. So who was the man who put all of this together, this arc of animals and art in 42 large volumes? Albert Karl Ludwig Gotthelf Gunter was a German-born zoologist with a focus on ichthyology and hepatology. The geographical distribution of animals was a particular interest of his, and I soon realized that he was definitely not a man to be put off by a large-scale cataloging project. So accumulating a visual catalogue of the fauna of the world, terrestrial and marine, in your spare time was definitely not going to be a problem. So one of his first jobs after arriving in Britain was cataloguing 2,000 snake specimens at the British Museum of Natural History in 1857. His next task was a catalogue of fishes. It ran to 8 volumes and took 12 years. The British Museum obviously decided he was a man to get things done and appointed him Keeper of Zoology in 1875. Gunter's widowed mother had left Germany for Britain to teach German when he was still a student in Germany. And to her, it was the promised land. She infected her son with her love of English language, literature, and culture. She told him of the many funny ways so different from ours, which prompted him to write, "Somehow I never felt a stranger from the first day I stepped on English soil. And it was just as well that I was reminded sometimes that I was a foreigner. At that time, Germans in England were rather liked than disliked and feared, as is the case now. They were treated in a friendly, condescending manner, and often as useful, clever pets." Well, useful and clever he certainly was, and he was put to good use, not least by the Linnean Society itself, where he served as president from 1894 to 1900. One not so clever aspect of his presidency, however, was his stance towards admitting women as fellows. He wrote, although I wished that the numbers of new fellows would increase, thus helping the society over a period of rather straitened finances, I could not make up my mind to effect that increase by the admission of female fellows. In fact, he was surrounded by talented women with possible links to the albums as well. Gunter's first wife, Roberta, was an accomplished zoological illustrator, especially of marine creatures. And Gunter's mother, Louisa, was also a gifted artist and painter of animals. In fact, her 1877 copy of the famous 1626 Savary painting of the dodo greeted me when I started my research in Oxford. And here in one of the albums, there is another extinct bird, which could be called Northern Europe's very own dodo, the Flightless Great Oak, extinct since the mid-19th century. It caught my eye because it was an original drawing, not a print. So the one on the right-hand side here. So looking closer at the handwritten notes, it seems that the drawing is by Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins. In the 1850s, Hawkins worked with Richard Owen on the famous dinosaur models for the Crystal Palace. How fitting that he should have drawn the Great Oak as well. The drawing is from nature of the specimen kept in the London Natural History Museum. The next slide, please. Another intriguing original drawing is this lizard, probably the giant butterfly lizard found in Vietnam and China. Following the handwritten note, I came across the Rhys Collection held at the Natural History Museum in London. It contains more than 2,000 botanical and zoological paintings collected or commissioned by John Rhys during his time in China. He worked as a tea merchant for the East India Tea Company. And I must say, I nearly fainted when I looked at the Gunter drawing because it had clearly been cut from a larger piece of paper. To my great relief, the original NHM illustration seems complete. Phew. Was this beautiful copy made by Gunter's mother or wife? The carefully copied Chinese characters mean something like Guangdong, which is in South China, gecko. Can I see the next slide, please? For the fishes, there are some particular beauties to be found, which do seem to be actual woodblock prints, not hand-drawn copies. Hiroshige was a master of the Japanese woodblock printing. Best known for his landscapes, he also created a grand series of fishes. 17 of Hiroshige's 20 fishes prints can be found in the albums. We know that Gunter had a veritable menagerie at home. He kept several giant tortoises as pets and tui birds from New Zealand. He also bred many rarer British and European birds successfully. So to conclude, I like to think of Gunter's albums as an extension of his menagerie. They were his clever, useful pets. The art, data, and countless histories contained in them awaits further research, and I hope that L50 will get many people as curious as I was 7 years ago when I first opened one of the big red volumes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elaine, and thank you for joining us all the way from Berlin. Last but not least, we have Glenn Benson, who works at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and he is our honorary curator of artifacts here at the Linnean Society. He looks after and gets greatly enthusiastic about our collections of busts, medals, and various objects. And he adds to the collection by sometimes bringing quirky Linnaeus-related items to them. Glenn.
Yeah, it's obviously got too much time on my hands. I'm always searching for Linnaeus on the internet. So welcome everybody, and it's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you this evening. I really love the thing that I'm talking about, and it's wonderful. I'm very interested in when art and science come together. And working in the V&A, which originally was a museum of art and science, and working there as a day job, and then in my spare time doing what I can for the Linnean Society, it's a wonderful opportunity to keep mixing those two disciplines together. And William Keble Martin's paint box, which we're looking at here, is a lovely example of those two disciplines coming together as well. And it's interesting for a man who had such humble beginnings, was such a humble person, that he became such a celebrity. And one of the things that also strikes me about him too, is that we all know him as Keble Martin. We very rarely call him Reverend William Keble Martin. Keble comes from the fact, having been born into a very religious family, he was named after John Keble, the great theologian, who was the driver of the Oxford movement, which was the idea that the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church should sort of, well, at least the Anglican Church should share more of the Catholic traditions. So it's interesting that we all know him as Keble Martin rather than William Keble Martin, and I'll stick to the Keble Martin. And it's also interesting that he died around almost 51 years ago. He died on the 26th of November, 1969. He was born at a time of the great Victorian era. Queen Victoria had just been made the Empress of India in 1877. There's all the great technological change going on in the Victorian era. And here's this country parson who quietly becomes fascinated by the natural world around him and his local natural world, which is something we've all experienced recently with lockdown, is how a lot of people have become very interested in their local environment. From a very young age, he was fascinated by plants. He talks about when he was 6, he was given some geraniums to plant, and he was terribly upset that when they moved house, the removal men forgot to bring the geraniums. He used to sugar trees to attract moths so he could study them, and things like that. So he's had this lovely kind of upbringing of being surrounded by nature. But we just need to talk about his paint box here. And I'll explain a little bit later as to why he becomes such a celebrity. But we need to start off with this very personal object. Again, another reason I love this is because you can see his finger marks in those tubes of paint. You can see where he squeezed them. You can see the popular ones. You can see the loved ones in there. And it's a really personal item that we have in the collection. And in this photograph here, we also happen to be seeing 2 of the most important tubes of paint. This is the cobalt blue and the cobalt yellow, because in 1930, by accident, he mixed those 2 colors together and realized it made the perfect green for painting plants. And I feel sorry for him because he'd been painting his plants since 1899. And there in 1930, he discovers the right green. And he feels like he has to go back and repaint some of those things he had done earlier. So this man truly was dedicated to his craft. And he spends the best of kind of 60 years meticulously painting the flora of Great Britain. And he ends up with producing something like 1,400 watercolors that ultimately go into a book that will become a bestseller. Next, please. The other thing I love about him, and if you want to read about his life, he wrote a wonderful biography called Over the Hills, and it's been a great read to learn about him. And in January of 1965, which is the year that the British Flora in Colour was published, he married his second wife, the lovely Florence Lewis, who everybody called Flora, which was terribly appropriate that he should marry someone whose nickname was Flora. And on their wedding day in January 1965, as his wedding gift to his second wife, he gave her all his sketches, saying to his future wife, "What greater gift can I give you than my life's work?" And we're very lucky that 20 years later, Florence Martin then donated those sketches to the Linnean Society. And we see here on the slide, the sketch next to the illustration from the book. So we have 5 bound volumes of those sketches within the Linnean Society collection, and they are wonderful to look at. Like Elaine was saying, it's very easy to spend many hours without noticing, flicking through them. And they're full of notes about where he found the plant, when he drew it, when he redrew it, and things like that. So they're kind of fascinating loose leaf pieces of paper that kind of tell you the story of how he created this incredible book on the British flora. We're also very lucky to have his microscope, and we're also very lucky to have a sort of mounted lens that obviously he must have used to capture the details of the plants. Because when he set out to create this book in 1906, he wanted to create a guide to the flora of Britain that was accurate, that the plants would be life-size, that it could be used to identify species of plants, almost like a sort of field guide. As it turned out, the book physically turned out to be, I think, too large to put into most people's pockets, but it was set out as a field guide. But he was kind of, though he's not the first flora of Britain, it's certainly the first where it concentrates on the images. And the way he worked was he started off by putting usually one plant in one corner, and then he would fill the rest of the sheet with related species to that one plant. And I can tell you that some of those sheets took 20 years to complete. So they went from having perhaps 1 or 2 plants featured on the sheet, and it would then take him roughly about 20 years to finally finish every plant for each of the various plates. Next, please. So I just wanted to flag up that this amazing book that was the bestseller of 1965, 25,000 copies of this book sold in 4 weeks, 100,000 copies sold in roughly a year. And 12 impressions later, by the 1980s, 1.5 million copies had been sold around the world. And what I'm showing here are some examples of what else was going on in the world in 1965, whether it the space race, the Beatlemania that it was at its peak, the rise literally of the miniskirt as hems rose across Western Europe, mainly under the effect of Mary Quant. This was an era of social change and race riots and sexual liberation and things like that. And the big thing in the bottom of that slide looks a bit like a giant fridge. It's actually one of the first commercial mini computers with its huge 16-bit memory. So this was a huge era of change, and into this very modern, vibrant world comes Keble Martin's book and becomes a bestseller. And I think I'm going to finish by just recounting what he said about a letter that he received. People all over the world wrote to him. This book meant so much to so many people. And even today, talking to people like Mark, or if you talk to some of the other botanists in the Linnean Society, if you do a quick search on social media, many, many people will tell you that this book got them interested in gardening, got them interested in botany, got them interested in natural history. It's phenomenal, the care and the love and how much people cherish this book. I've got mine, and it's well thumbed, and I've even used it at work at the V&A. I've got a reputation for helping to identify plants and animals that feature on some of our works of art. So I was actually using mine last week to identify some flowers on a waistcoat. So again, I'm really pleased to get to talk about his paint box, because as I say, this book that was the ultimate result of all his 60 years of labour is such a well-loved and literally well-thumbed edition around the world. And the other thing too I'd say about him was he was a man who loved all branches of natural history, like the Linnean Society does. We're interested in all aspects of the natural world. And Keble Martin kind of epitomizes that. And I think he also epitomizes the fact that we embrace the amateur naturalist as well as the professional naturalist. I'm very much an amateur, and for me, Keble Martin also kind of embodies that idea that society welcomes everybody. You just have to be interested in natural history. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Wonderful talk. Thank you. I particularly like the imprint on the paint tubes. Very, very touching.
Yeah.
Thank you to all our speakers for making the time to come and speak about the items that you wrote on in the book. We very much appreciate it. The book was meant to be a souvenir item for visitors who had gone on a tour of the collections or come to do research in the library. As it is, we were supposed to launch it at the last anniversary meeting in May. It was pushed back in the hope that we might be able to launch it in-house. But in the present conditions with COVID, its kind of role has reversed, and it's now almost become a sort of showcase for our collections, hopefully to invite some of you who attended the webinar today and who haven't been to the Society to come and visit us when we're opened again, or to come and do some research in the library. In the meantime, there are 3 ways you can access some of our collections online and from the safety of your own home. So the next few slides just show you our 3 systems, 3 different ways of accessing information about our collections. There is the library catalogue, as seen on this slide. And I should say all 3 systems, unfortunately, the 3 systems don't talk to each other. So if you want to do a full search of our collections, you might need to do search in all 3. But the links can all be found on the collections page on our website. So the library catalogue is our oldest our oldest catalogue. It includes books and journals, but also photographs or oil paintings. Next up is the newer archives catalogue. So next slide, please. Thank you. The archives catalogue, which is constantly added to, as is the library catalogue, and includes manuscripts, correspondence, and a lot of the objects that and items that have been talked about tonight. And then finally, the online collections. So these are the digitized collections that have been put up online. And there you can browse the letters of Linnaeus, his specimens, his manuscripts, and his annotated books. The Herbarium of James Edward Smith that Mark was so eloquently talking about earlier, the Alfred Wallace's notebook, and some of Francis Buchanan's artwork. And before I hand over to Leonie to say the final thank yous and describe how to obtain the book, I would like to just thank Leonie herself, because no one else is going to do it. And because really this book would not exist without her. Her knowledge of the collections, her keen eye for detail and design, and her professionalism and perfectionism. In addition to collaborating with me to research all the items and correspond with the authors, Leonie single-handedly did all the photography, the page layout, and all the editing, which is an immense amount of work. Our book, for me, is truly the achievement of my professional year, and I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity to collaborate with such a great colleague. And it's been a lot of work, but it's also been a lot of fun. So thank you, Leonie, and over to you.
I don't know what to say to that. Sorry. Thank you, Isabel. That's really lovely. Thank you so much. And I've really enjoyed working with you as well. It's been really brilliant. I know it's been a huge amount of work, but it's been really brilliant. And it's, I think, opened up definitely our eyes to things we didn't know about in the collection. So, you know, hopefully it'll open up everybody else's eyes. So that it just remains for me to say some thank yous. First, we'd like to thank all of the contributors for their time, their amazing expertise, and their support with this book. It would absolutely not have been possible without them. They're listed here. So I think we give them all a big clap because they're quite amazing. We also want to say a huge thanks to our president, Dr. Sandy Knapp, and our trustees for their encouragement, and to our brilliant curators, Glenn Benson, Mark Spencer, Suzanne Ryder, and Ollie Crimmen. Thank you so much. Finally, we'd also like to say a massive thank you to everyone of this amazing staff team. I mean, if you've been into the society, hopefully you will know that we are a small team, but we are a very strong team and we all support each other. So I want to say thanks to everyone in general, but thanks to Elizabeth Rawlinson for assisting with proofing, Andrea Deneau and Jana Ashdown for support with proofing and photography, and to Padma Ghosh, Helen Shaw, Ross Eaglemeyer and Joe Burton for their help with this event and promotion. We are incredibly grateful to everybody because we couldn't have done it without you. So thank you so much. Before I turn it into the Oscars, can we go to the next slide? So in order to purchase the book, basically to celebrate the launch of this first book of treasures, it'll be available for a reduced price of only £10 until the 7th of December. So that's kind of a bargain, really. If you're thinking of purchasing a copy, you better be quick. And you could buy copies from our website, which is shown there. But if you can't see it, then the address is www.linnean.org/L50. So you can buy it there. So it's £10 until the 7th of December. And also this is a bit of a shameless plug, but we also have some new designs, puffin, Arctic fox, but they're also available on the shop on our website. So you can buy packs of those at the moment. Sorry, shameless plug. Okay. And now I think Padma's going to take control and direct any questions that have come in.
Okay, so we have a question for Ranit. He may have said, but I had to go away. Where was the 1797 catalogue printed and by whom? Or did the ERC do their own printing?
Well, it's an interesting question. I would answer it this way. The East India Company did everything, including having their own navy. And if you go into the history of the East India Company, you realize that they were something completely different. So I presume they would have printed it themselves in one of their printing works. But it's not mentioned in the tea catalogue.
Right. Thank you. There's a question for Glenn. How do we know about Cabell Martin's watercolor choices? Did he make a record of which pigments he used for particular purposes?
Unfortunately, no. All we really got to go on are those few pigments that are left in his paint box. There is some work being done by the Royal Albert Memorial Museum in Exeter, who've also have collections of Cabell Martins, and they've been looking at in some of the sketches. So no, the short answer is no, we don't. He particularly liked Winsor and Newton's new, what they called their moist pigments. They invented those in the kind of, I suppose somewhere in the 1830s, where they began to mix pigment with glycerine, which made them much more pliable. And he was very fond of those. So I think there's some further study to be done in actually going through the archive of Winsor and Newton, maybe to establish kind of those colours that he was using.
Right.
My next project.
Thanks, Glenn. I think this is a question for collections. I think it's asking how much of our catalogue is digitally stored. I think is there any concrete step to catalogue all of them digitally and place it online?
Okay. I haven't seen the question, but I'll try and answer it. I think it depends on what type of collection you're talking about. So for the library, I would say most of the books are catalogued, except for most of our journals. It's the archives really that we've started cataloguing in earnest. In terms of proportion, it's hard to say, but certainly they're all indexed on the index card, and we have various finding aids, but not all of that has been transferred on an online catalogue. And also the archives are divided between our collected archives, which are manuscripts and illustrations and drawings and photographs, coming from our fellows, and then our domestic archives, which would include letters that were sent to the Linnean Society, the council minutes, or any committee minutes. And those domestic archives have not been catalogued at all at the moment, or very few. We have the society papers. So it's quite a complex question. What I would say is it's ongoing. It's ongoing possibly at greater speed thanks to COVID, because we have all these finding aids that we've been able, our archivist Liz McGow and Luke Thorne have been able to catalogue these from home during COVID. So we've actually made a lot of progress in the last 9 months on cataloguing our archives.
Thanks, Isa. One last unanswered question. Are there any algae related items, specimens? Oh, Mark really wants to take it. Mark, unmute. Unmute.
Apologies. Also, slightly follow on from the previous question, there are many organisations are actually doing their best to digitise and make their collections accessible. So organisations such as the Natural History Museum and Kew and organisations around the world are trying to do their best to get their many millions of specimens online. Unfortunately, it is time consuming and expensive ultimately, but we are all doing our best to catch up with the modern world and get into the new environments that we're in. Yes, there are lots of algal materials in the Linnean Society. So both the Smith Herbarium and the Linnean Herbarium have algal collections. One of the problems for most people in the modern world is that our biological materials are collated using 18th or early 19th century names. So you may not be able to find what you need. So you will need to contact a curator such as myself. And there are also, as Isabelle, I'll hand over to Isabelle now, lots in the library and archives relating to algae.
Yes. Yeah. I was in the middle of trying to put the link in the book in the chat, so you've taken me by surprise. Well, yes, there will be lots in the library, in the archives. I don't know so much, but one very, very special items on algae that we have in the library is Anna Atkins cyanotypes, which is actually in the book. It has made it into the book because it's such a beautiful early photography, example of early photography on blue paper. Here we go. So to learn more about this very, very special book, and I think we've been told that our copy in the library is particularly beautiful and well preserved, so you need to buy the book.
Ranit, you wanted to take one of the tea questions?
Yes, I saw it in the Q&A.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, to the person who's asked where East India Company House was, it was at in Leadenhall Street in the City of London. And to the answer to Mr. Alistair Sawyer of Chichester is, he asked the question is, when did the growth of tea drinking increase in Great Britain? Well, it's not an easy question to answer, but the three peaks were during the start of the Industrial Revolution, because people wanted to drink potable water. So they said we might as well have a beverage, and tea had just come in. So that was around 1760. Then there was the temperance movement around 1820, which encouraged you to drink tea and not alcohol. Not pointing to you, Mark. And then we recently discovered that the sugar lobby actually did try to promote the positive side of tea, because there were a lot of essayists in those days who said that tea is actually a drug and it's bad for you. So we do get along with our friends. So the sugar lobby also pressed for that. And all of this helped in the consumption of tea increasing. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ranit. There's one last thing. Somebody's asking, 2 new publications were mentioned during the talks. One was Cobalt Martin, but there was another mentioned earlier, but she did not manage to make. Was this you, Glenn? Or...
I think it might have been me. Is it Mark's book that they're asking about?
Well, I hope so, because
okay.
The question is from Alison M.H.
Okay, well, if this is, I think, maybe what you're talking about, but I did mention Mark, who was one of our panelists, his new book, which is Murder Most Florid, and that's the one that's about forensic botany. It's very good, very good. Mark, do you want to do a plug?
Go ahead.
Good. It's a ripping read.
Thank you very much, Sandy. That was very kind of you. Yeah, so the book is basically about my personal experiences and the science of how we use plants and the environment to help solve crime.
Right. So since Sandy is here, Sandy, do you want to say a couple of things before we wrap up?
Well, I just want to say that I'm the current president of the Linnean Society, and it's something that someone does for a very short time. And I'm really lucky because this has happened during the time that I'm president. And this is something that I think that it's such a wonderful way of opening up the treasure chest that's the society. But the collections are one thing, but actually it's the people in the society which make the society. There are fellows all around the world. I see there are people from India here tonight, and there are people from all over. But also it's the staff who are in Burlington House who really have pulled together as an incredible team to make this book, which is a song to our collections, but it's also a song to their skill, their dedication, and their absolute love of the place where they work. And I think it's a real privilege to be the president of a place like that, where people think enough of it to do something as wonderful as this. And I think the interesting thing about the society is Glenn said it when he was talking about William Keble Martin, is that it's a place for everyone. The Linnean Society is for all of us, whether we're a professional botanist, a professional zoologist, a geologist. It's for people who love the natural world, because our vision is a world where nature is valued and understood. And I think that that's one of the things that sets the Linnean Society apart from many other learned societies and really turns us into what is a proper charity, is the fact that it's for everyone. And we're about anyone who loves natural history can become a fellow of the society and contribute to our charitable public good, which involves education, heritage, and science, which basically is all of human endeavor that has to do with the natural world. So I just want to thank all of you on the staff for producing an amazing, amazing production. It's absolutely beautiful. And first day I got it, I couldn't put it down, and I'm looking forward to reading it again. So many congratulations to all of you.
Okay, before everyone leaves, can I take a group shot? Everyone say, buy the book.
Buy the book.
Buy the book.
And become a fellow. People who aren't fellows yet in the audience, please do think about becoming a fellow of the society and participating in this great adventure we're on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.